Segal is the Ira A. Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR. He's an expert on security issues, technology development, and Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Adam has numerous influential writings in CFR reports, books, and articles for leading magazines and sites. He currently writes for the blog Net Politics. Please welcome Adam to the S4 Main Stage.
Good morning. I think Dale yesterday in his introduction spoke about out-of-vision speeches, so I think I might be the most out-of-vision. But my proposition is simple, and that is that China is the most active shaper of cybersecurity and cyberspace right now, and that decisions that Beijing takes, from regulatory to technical standards to diplomacy to overseas investment, are going to be the most consequential in shaping cyberspace and are going to touch all of us and affect all of us. These decisions are being taken at the highest level. In February of 2014, the Chinese created a small and leadership group on cybersecurity, which is a sort of ad hoc task force which involves members of the Politburo and is headed by President Xi Jinping himself. When you create a small leadership organization, basically it means this is a high priority, that you want to push it through the bureaucracy, and that everyone should get in line behind those decisions. And in that first meeting in February of 2014, President Xi laid out his vision for what China should become. He said, without cybersecurity, there is no national security, and without digitalization, there is no modernization. And he said that China should move from what it is now, which is a big cyber power because it has 750 million users in China, right, to a super cyber power, right, from a big power to a super cyber power. Parallel to this plan on cybersecurity, China wants to ensure that it is going to dominate the next generations of technologies. Right? We've heard a lot already about artificial intelligence. China announced its next generation development plan for artificial intelligence with the goal that by 2025, China should be an innovation leader with a market of 60 billion, and by 2030, the premier innovation center with a market of 130 billion. Right? So China plans to dominate the next generation of technologies, and it is actively thinking about how it can shape cybersecurity and cyberspace. What I'm going to do in this talk is four things. I'm going to talk a little bit about Chinese motivation. Why is it so concerned about cybersecurity? I'm going to talk about what methods it's adopted both domestically and internationally. I'm going to tell you what I don't know and what I'm uncertain about and what other people should tell you they're also uncertain about. And then I'll talk a little bit about maybe what the US should do in response. So the motivations. Cybersecurity touches on three core interests for the Chinese leadership. Right, three core interests. The first one is domestic stability and regime legitimacy. So this is the part of the Chinese internet or internet that we're probably most familiar with, known outside of China as the Great Firewall of China, right? The desire to block technology and information from the outside, right? When the internet first came to China, there was a brief period where an outside analyst and even some Chinese themselves thought it would lead to the opening of China. President Bill Clinton very famously said that trying to control the internet in China would be like nailing Jell-O to the wall. Well, it turns out that the Chinese are very good at nailing Jell-O, right? And what we've seen is, especially under President Xi Jinping, is a massive tightening on civil society and increasingly technical sophistication in blocking the web. Right, so in the run-up to the 19th Party Congress, China was censoring individual photos inside WhatsApp and WeChat conversations. It has moved to real name registration on the internet, right? So everywhere you go in China, you have to use your real name, and now is increasingly blocking the use of VPNs and trying to force foreign businesses, intellectuals, others that get around the Great Firewall of China onto VPNs provided by the Chinese state. So it is very concerned about the flow of information. It is its top priority. And that's probably the part that we have seen the most. The second core interest, of course, is just cybersecurity and national security. And here the Chinese have always thought that they are the more vulnerable partner in the US-China relationship. Right? We tend to see ourselves as being incredibly vulnerable to disruptive attacks, but the Chinese have always thought that they are the more vulnerable partner, in part because they are so dependent on foreign technology. Right? Even before Edward Snowden's revelations and disclosures, the Chinese already assumed that foreign technology companies, and US companies in particular, provided assistance to the NSA through backdoors and other technical means. And the Chinese were talking about what they call the 8 guardian warriors who dominate the Chinese market. Those 8 guardians are Qualcomm, Cisco, Intel, Microsoft, Google, Apple, Intel, and I knew I was going to forget all 8. And an 8th one. So they were always concerned about those technologies, and they were always concerned that there were backdoors there. And even in the industrial control systems area in December of 2014, there was a newspaper article that described setting up an information lab for security for ICS systems. The headline of that article was China's information security situation in ICS and industrial control systems is grim. And the main argument of that article was, why is it so grim? It's because those systems are foreign supplied. Foreign supplied, and that means that foreigners are going to have to update it, they're going to have to service it, and we can't control that technology. The third concern is a broad and deep techno-nationalism, right? We think about China as an economic powerhouse. We think about it as being factory to the world. The Chinese don't want to be the factory to the world anymore. They want to move from made in China to invented in China, innovated in China. Right? They're concerned about what's called the middle income trap, which is that you reach a certain level and you cannot move up to the value chain. And so they want to become more and more competitive in higher level technologies. Part of that strategy, as we all know, has been a broad strategy and campaign of cyber espionage, industrial espionage, but it has also included a massive push on R&D inside of China. I mentioned artificial intelligence, but also in quantum computing, right? So the Chinese probably are still dragging behind the United States in computing, but on quantum communications, they've already run out a line between Beijing and Shanghai and launched a satellite that's involved in quantum communications. The next generation of manufacturing, IoT-enabled manufacturing, and a plan called Made in China 2025. And also in semiconductors, somewhere between $100 and $150 billion provided for acquisitions abroad. So the Chinese don't want to be dependent upon the West for technology. So these 3 core interests all come together in cybersecurity, and we can see why the Chinese push so hard in this space. What are they doing? So at home, it's important to think of a broad range of policies that touch these 3 issues. The most important being the national security law, which introduced the idea of secure and controllable. Right? So any technology that's used, especially in critical infrastructure, should be secure and controllable. The anti-terrorism law, which talks about backdoors and encryption and how do you fight that. And then most importantly, the cybersecurity law, which was begun implementation in June of 2017. The cybersecurity law introduces this idea of the critical information infrastructure, right? As with most Chinese regulations, they didn't really define what critical information infrastructure means. They laid out some areas where it was obvious, right? So similar areas that we think of as critical infrastructure, communications, transportation, chemical factories, but they also, in a draft, talked about critical information infrastructure, including health plans, health data, media, and in particular, big data and cloud computing. Right? If you are designated CII, right, so critical information infrastructure, then you have to fall under a new set of regulations. Problem is, we don't know what that CII is, and we don't know who's going to be designated. Right now, the designation happens through what's called the Cyberspace Administration of China, also a new organization, working with MIIT, the Ministry of Information and Industrial Technologies, and the MPS, the Ministry of Public Security, which is the internal security organ. What we're going to see probably is competition among those three organizations and the line agencies to say, yes, of course this is critical information infrastructure, right? No bureaucrat ever lost their job from regulating too many things. So we're going to see probably a lot of competition and a lot of one-upmanship to say what we regulate, what we supervise. Of course, it's CII. So that's going to be, I think, very escalatory and inflationary for kind of what the regulations are going to concern. CII regulations and the Cybersecurity National Law has three important provisions. The first is if you deal with this structures, any network equipment that you put into it has to go underneath a security review. Right? The security review is going to be administered by a branch of the Ministry of State Security, which is the foreign intelligence side. We're not sure what it's going to involve, but early suggestions have included access to source codes, perhaps the use of backdoors and other security provisions. Any critical business data, again, has not been defined yet, must be stored in China, right? So the Chinese are moving towards data localization. And then finally, a set of regulations about what types of security reviews you have to undergo. So it's going to be, as far as we can tell, very, very expansive and involve almost any network provider for a whole range of industries. This month, China also announced its action plan from 2018 to 2020, covering industrial control systems. Again, it has a very strong focus on foreign technology. So there is a discussion about common R&D platforms and how do you move towards technical standards within China that all the companies can adopt. But it also talks about an emergency management system, information sharing, which is required by law in China. Right? So if the government comes and says we want threat information, you can't say, well, we don't want to share it for privacy reasons or commercial reasons, and personnel development and a whole range of other strategies as it moves forward. This is the main domestic component. Internationally, the big push is something that's called One Belt and One Road. Right? You may have heard this. This is China's plan to develop basically in the sea from China through Southeast Asia, through South Asia, to all the way to East Africa, a network of ports and other shipping lines, and then over land from China through Central Asia, through the Middle East to Southern Europe. Massive infrastructure investment. Right now, it's hard to get a real sense of how big it's going to be, which plans are going to work, but the estimates are about 65 countries and $1 trillion. Right? Massive investments in roads, pipelines, electrical power grids, shipping infrastructure, airport infrastructure, which of course is going to create a massive demand for Chinese producers and suppliers. Right? This strategy essentially is a domestic strategy as a foreign policy. Right? China has overcapacity. It has to send it abroad, so invest in all these projects. And these companies, of course, are going to bring their vision of Chinese security, Chinese regulation, to countries that don't have a lot of capacity. Right? Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, they're going to basically turn to their Chinese suppliers and say, what should we be doing in this space? Right? The US has essentially withdrawn from this because we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific program, the free trade agreement, which you can argue about one way or another, but it did have a set of standards around cybersecurity and data localization that would allow the US to try to project its vision of how these things should be organized in this space. The other side of China's outward push is a set of diplomatic negotiations about the rules of behavior for states in cyberspace. So we know that if you read open source Chinese writers, so defense planners, defense analysts, they talk about cyber attacks as having a strong deterrent value against an unnamed, technologically advanced competitor that's coming from the Western Pacific. So it's pretty easy to figure out who that would be. But if China was to be involved in a military conflict with that country, one way you might be able to deter it would be a destructive cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Right? You could convince that this technically advanced country that it would be not worth it, and that you could reach out and touch the homeland through an attack on critical infrastructure. And these defense analysts say, well, to prepare for those attacks, of course you have to map those structures, and that explains probably why we see, in some instances, Chinese operators inside US critical infrastructure. Right? They're preparing for if a conflict breaks out in the South China Seas or over Taiwan, do you launch an attack that deters the United States from becoming more involved? The problem is we have no agreement about what is an attack, right? When you cross the threshold for, in the US's vision, an act of war or use of force, an armed attack, how much mapping in the battlefield you can do. And so you have a situation where both sides think they have to launch a cyber attack quickly and no common agreement about what is crossing a threshold. The US has tried to engage China and other countries in a discussion about what laws apply in cyberspace, mainly through the United Nations group of government experts, where we have argued that the laws of armed conflict and international law apply. Right? We have said, look, there is already a structure in place. We've fought wars for hundreds of years with these laws in place. Neutrality, right? You shouldn't go through Belgium to get through France. Distinction, you should be able to tell the difference between a hospital and a military target. And proportionality. If I kill 50 people, you can't kill 2,000. Right? We think it's going to be hard to apply these ideas in cyberspace, but we should be having this discussion. Right? And that will help provide some predictability and stability in cyberspace. The Chinese kind of agreed. They signed off an agreement in 2015 that says, yes, we agree that the law, international law applies to cyberspace, especially the UN Charter. And so we signed that agreement with 15 other countries, and the US trumpeted that and said, we're all agreeing that international law applies. And the Chinese kind of basically went home and said, well, we're actually more focused on the UN Charter part, which says that countries can exercise sovereignty over cyberspace. Right? We have the right to exert our authority, promote our laws, regulate cyberspace like we regulate any other space. And so we've been kind of talking past each other ever since then, and have been really made no progress. And in fact, this year, this process, the UN group of government experts process, broke down. They could not reach any type of agreement about what type of norms states should behave and how they should behave in cyberspace, primarily because the US wanted to have a further discussion about when you can invoke the right of self-defense. Right? When can you launch an attack that may cross this threshold when you've been cyber attacked? And the Chinese basically said, we're not having that discussion. Right? You're militarizing cyberspace. You are, in fact, making cyberspace even more unstable, destable, and you're trying to move there. So this is the main ways that China is shaping the internet and cyberspace, primarily through domestic measures, outward investment, and a discussion around these norms. What am I uncertain about? What is going to shape the trajectory as we move forward? The first is we have a vision of the Chinese government as being incredibly unitary, right? It sets a plan, and everybody gets in line, and they get there, right? That's not how it works, right? Yes, the Chinese have a strategic vision, but with every Chinese law, implementation is a big deal, right? There is an old saying in Chinese studies, it's a cliche, but it's true, the heaven is high and the emperor is far away, right? The farther you are away from Beijing, the more likely you are to interpret the law in ways that meet local needs. And in some ways, China encourages that, right? In some ways, it's a federal system. They'll define a policy broadly, and then they'll see how localities implement the law, and they'll decide which one's the best one, and they'll make that one a national model. We've seen that in wave after wave of reform. And so it's possible that with implementation in the cybersecurity law, we will see a lot of variation. And as I've already alluded to, there are a lot of competing interests, right? There's the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is supposed to be in control, but like our DHS, has issues about capacity and regulatory authority. There's the Ministry of Public Security, which is the internal security agencies. There's the Ministry of State Security. There's the PLA, the People's Liberation Army itself. There's the Ministry of Information, and Information Technology. And there are foreign actors, right? US companies, European companies, Japanese companies are constantly trying to lobby and get policies swayed one way or the other. That ability to sway Chinese policy is getting narrower and narrower, but it's still not at the point where the Chinese completely ignore what foreign companies say, because they are still dependent on investment and markets and technology, although much, much less dependent than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So how the actual domestic politics is going to play out is a massive uncertainty. The second is the role of the Chinese companies themselves. Right? Chinese companies increasingly want to globalize. They want to act in international markets, and they are falling asunder into the traps of cybersecurity concerns in other countries as well, like US companies are in China, right? Huawei's deals keep getting blocked in the United States. ZTE's had lots of issues. Ant Financial couldn't make its purchase because of data localization, personal data concerns, right? So Chinese firms, as they globalize, should have similar interests to other global companies, which is we don't want to have 183 different national cybersecurity laws with different requirements for source code access or data localization. They would probably want the same transparent third-party standards that other countries are going to argue for. And Huawei, no matter how problematic it may be, has been started making that argument. They're saying, yes, we want third-party inspection. We're going to be open about our source code. You guys can see whatever you want. Right? So the companies should have a similar interest to foreign companies. The problem is, with this argument, is that inside China itself, the tech companies are becoming increasingly reliant on the state. So the tech companies used to be somewhat separated. They used to be more in the private economy, but now they are drawing even more attention from the center, and their interests are becoming even more tightly tied to the party and the state. And we also know that the Chinese government is more than willing to sacrifice private interests, commercial interests, for these core national security interests, right? Probably the most bright example of this would be the Great Cannon attack on GitHub, right? If you remember, advertising data streams were hijacked from Baidu, the Chinese search engine, used to knock off sites on GitHub that were hosting the New York Times in Chinese and anti-circumvention technology. Baidu was a company that the Chinese had basically saying, we want them to go global, we want them to internationalize. So the Chinese seem more than willing in this case to embarrass Baidu, raise suspicion about it for these core security issues. And then finally, the third great uncertainty is US policy, right? As I mentioned, the Chinese have been incredibly active in this space over the last year. In part because we've had a pause on US policy as the Trump administration comes in and gets people there and gets its vision about what international cyber diplomacy should be. But also, we are probably on the brink of a massive trade war with China. Right? The Trump administration has been preparing Section 301 investigations of intellectual property theft. And one of the main concerns of these data localization issues and backdoors and other things. And we may start seeing tariffs and quotas on other Chinese products, and the Chinese are not going to just sit around and take it. Right? They are going to punish US companies in the market. Tech companies will probably be a first target of those retaliations. So 3 great uncertainties. What actually happens domestically, politics, what happens to Chinese firms, and quite honestly, what happens to US-China trade as the administration begins to think about trade wars. What should be done, right? And here, to be quite honest, the US and other actors don't have a huge amount of leverage because, as I pointed out at the beginning, these are three core interests for the Chinese government: domestic stability, national security, techno-nationalism. Long-standing core interests that are very, very immune to pressure. That said, some things have worked in the past. The thing that has been most useful is that if you get all foreign companies and all foreign countries unified on an issue, and you don't have any defection, right? So there have been two primary cases where the Chinese actually backed down. One was on WAPI, which was an alternative to Wi-Fi. When it was first rolled out, the Chinese insisted that if you wanted to do business in China, you had to partner with 11 Chinese companies, almost all tied to the Ministry of State Security. You had to transfer technology. You had to develop this WAPI chip, right? There were no defections in that case. All US companies, all foreign companies said they refused. The US government wrote a letter that seriously threatened WTO action. Europe and Japan were both on board, and the Chinese eventually backed down. Although, of course, there is now a WAPI chip in Apple and other places. But at the time, the Chinese backed down, and everybody pushed forward on Wi-Fi. The other case was Green Dam, which was a censorship technology that the Chinese insisted be installed on all computers right away. That they also backed down on, again, from external pressure and domestic pressure. Chinese users rebelled in that case because it was, in fact, incredibly buggy, put spyware on your computer and everything else. So we do have some cases where the Chinese have backed down, but it's getting harder and harder to put those things together, right? Certainly we need more discussion, right? So I told you about how I'm worried about we don't understand each other's thresholds. The problem is that the normal way to have these discussions would be military to military. But as you may remember, in May of 2014, the US government indicted 5 hackers from the People's Liberation Army for industrial espionage, for cyber industrial espionage. And ever since then, the Chinese said, we're not having any discussions until you lift the indictments, which is, of course, not going to happen. So you have to figure out how can you have this discussion in other forums. The UN is maybe a possibility if we restart it, but it may be more important to get those agreements with our allies. Right? Japan, the EU, others, we can all kind of agree on, you know what, this is the type of cyber attack that we know is crossing the threshold, we're going to respond to, and we can signal to the Chinese and others how we think about those attacks. And then finally is this idea of reciprocity. Right? This, I think, is a pretty good motivator for how we deal with the Chinese, which is anything we cannot do in the Chinese market, they shouldn't be allowed to do in the domestic market. Right? The Chinese limit the number of media, they tightly restrict them, but we allow as many Chinese press people to come to the United States as possible. The Chinese pretty much have, up until recently, been able to buy lots and lots of technology companies, although that is changing. It's very hard for US companies to acquire Chinese technology in China. And we would never, we've begun to think about, should we have Kaspersky or Chinese companies in critical infrastructure? But the Chinese have been blocking it from the beginning. So one way for us to move forward is to increasingly think of reciprocity. But again, that may all fall apart if we enter into a straight-out trade war with the Chinese. So I'm going to finish here, but I'll just hit home my 3 big points, which is China is restructuring, reshaping the internet, the cyberspace as we speak, partly out of its own concerns, right? Domestic security, cybersecurity, national security, and techno-nationalism, and partly because the US is in a pause, right, and is unable to engage internationally in a lot of these issues. And if we don't move soon, the Chinese are going to really set all of these technologies that are going to affect us for the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you very much.